Welcome, my friends, to another episode of Shoot First, Ask Questions Later. Today, we are joined by Rabbi Shmuel Lubin, who is a musmach of the Rabbi Yitzchak Elchanan Theological Seminary, aka Yeshivas Rabbeinu Yitzchak Elchanan, as I do whenever I introduce someone. He's a doctoral candidate studying microbiology. We don't get many of people with that in their bio on the podcast. And he's also the creator of the Rishonim Podcast, which no doubt you will tell us a little bit about over the course of the episode, and we'll certainly link our I don't know what we call it, a partner podcast, a friend podcast. We'll link that in the description so people can check that out. Now, today we are going to be looking at, I believe, our first tshuva of the Ri Migash. And this is great because people have reached out to me. They said you didn't cover the Trumas Hadeshen. Well, we did an episode on the Trumas Hadeshen finally. And the Ri Migash is pretty important as well. So how about we start off by telling us what's the tshuva we're looking at and what do we have to know about the Ri Migash as we go into this tshuva?
Absolutely. First of all, of course, thank you so much for having me on. It's a tremendous honor. I'm proud to be one of the least qualified members of your guest cohort, but the Ri Migash is someone who I am very excited to talk about. I think I'd like to shoot first, as the podcast title implies, but just to give a little bit of background. So Reb Yehosef Halevi Ibn Migash, or he might have been pronouncing it Megas, something like that. I don't really know. But the important thing to know about him is that he was basically the Gadol Hador of the 12th century when he was living, at least within the world of Arabic-speaking Jewish communities, which were actually probably most of the Jewish communities at the time. There were some Jews living in that backwater known as Central Europe, but we don't need to talk about them for the purposes of this podcast.
And what's maybe tell us what's his connection with the Rambam? Because I think many of us are very familiar with the Rambam. Maybe we haven't heard the Ri Migash invoked as frequently. So what's his connection?
Good. So the Ri Migash was living in Muslim Spain. He was actually one of the last generations before a lot of the Jews were forced to leave Muslim Spain. He died probably around the year 1141, which means that the Rambam, who was living himself in that same place and around that, in those same cities, would have been around 5 years old when the Ri Migash passed away. And the Ri Migash, one of the Ri Migash's main students was someone by the name of Maimun Hadayan, who was related to the Rambam by the fact that he was the Rambam's father. The Rambam is Rav Moshe ben Maimon. And so the Rambam considered himself to be a student of the Ri Migash in some sense. I mean, he was only 5 years old when the Ri Migash passed away, so I don't know how much he would have been able to learn from him. Of course, the Rambam at 5 years old was, I'm sure, not like me at 5 years old, but still, I don't know how much he would have been able to get from him directly, but at least from his father, Reb Maimon, and it seems like Reb Maimon probably had notes from the Ri Migash. And so the Rambam himself considered the Ri Migash to be one of his main teachers, if not literally speaking, at least on a sort of spiritual sense.
So the Rambam, clearly he was devouring the Ri Migash's art school biographies as he grew up. He was his spiritual Rebbe. And what else do we know about him? I mean, what kind of works did the Ri Migash publish? I mean, I know we're going to be looking at Shuvos in a moment. Is there anything else noteworthy that we should be aware of?
We know that there are commentaries of the Ri Migash on the Gemara. You would have hopefully encountered these if you learned Mesechus Baba Basra, which Daf Yomi just completed recently. We have his commentary on Maseches Shavuos and a few other fragments here and there. It seems like he wrote a commentary to a big portion of the Talmud.
Right. So it seems like he's been very successful, and don't mind my video that's going out. I'm still here. But it's so he was considered the Gadol Hador. And so I would imagine any tshuva that he published carried a lot of significant weight to it. So what is this tshuva that we're looking at? What is this shaila that you've selected out of all the tshuvos that he's addressed that you believe is worthy of our attention for today?
Okay, so this is tshuva in. There were a few different editions of the Ri Migash, but this is classically siman number 114. Basically, somebody comes to the Ri Migash with this question: what would you say about this rabbi? And he describes a rabbi or someone who is appointed to be a rabbi who knows a lot about the tshuvas of the Gaonim. So this is a tshuva about tshuvas, which already makes it exciting.
This is quite meta.
Yeah. So already I think that's enough of a reason. But he says that there's this rabbi who knows a lot about the tshuvas of the Gaonim, but he really doesn't know how to learn Gemara. He can't decide for himself if, there's a tshuva of the Gaon or a halacha sefer from a Gaon, where that halacha came from in the Gemara, and he can evaluate whether it's correct or not correct. And the person writing to the Ri Migash says, after all, we all know that the tshuvas of the Gaonim, sometimes they might not be so reliable. Sometimes different Gaonim disagree with each other. Oh, and by the way, this guy also, he's not a Yarei Shemayim, and there are a lot of rumors about bad things that he did. By the way.
Yikes.
So,
Okay, so it's a rather brief tshuva, actually. I mean, just when I think of like tshuvos nowadays, you look at Tzitz Eliezer, and there's like enough after enough after enough. It seems rather terse, which I guess is useful for a 30-minute podcast.
That was generally the style of the Ri Migash, and I'd say there are kind of like two types of tshuvas in among his tshuvas. One of them is like this kind, where he just kind of answers the question, sometimes with a little bit of elaboration. And he has other tshuvas actually that are more like discussions of a whole sugya, where someone tries to ask him, could you explain to me what's going on in this Gemara? And then he'll give like a much more lengthier response. Or in some cases, if a particular case is extra complicated, then he'll have more to say. But usually he goes for the briefer style.
All right, so let's break it down, right? So just reiterate the shaila for us, and how does he address it?
So the question is, can you trust or can you appoint someone to be the rabbi who doesn't know how to learn Gemara, but he knows a lot of halachas from tshuvas of the Gaonim?
Right, and this would be the equivalent to, it sounds like the equivalent today of, I read through the Art Scroll, Kashrus book. I read the Rabbi Forst books. I memorized all the bullet points, but I don't necessarily know all the sugyos of where they emanated from.
Exactly. It's in many ways, I think, a very timeless question. And the Ri Migash, so what he answers is, he says, the person asking him the question is clearly, it sounds like, although I'll maybe talk about this in a minute, but it sounds like he's just trying to get rid of this rabbi, or kind of denigrate someone who tries to, bring a proof from the Gaonim, and the person writing the letter saying, you just don't know how to learn, so forget about it.
Oh, so this is interesting, right? Because the person who is giving the inquiry, this is his perspective. He might be exaggerating how much of an Amma Aretz this rabbi is. Like, maybe he does know Gemara. Maybe he just doesn't know how to do the pin test and can't point to you every. I mean, I'm not sure what their Gemaras looked like back then. I'm obviously partial to the Vilna edition. But if they did whatever the pin test equivalent would be back then, maybe he wasn't the biggest bucky. But it's hard to believe that if he could navigate the chuvos of the Gaonim, that he wouldn't have any facility with the Gemara itself.
Yeah, so this is a big question, and about all of the 200 tshuvas or so that we have from the Ri Migash, we have very little context. We don't know like what the background story was. We only have the question as it appears in the tshuva, which, by the way, they were actually almost certainly translated from Arabic. And there might have been some details that were lost in translation, or that the translator didn't think were important to reproduce. It happens to be in this one tshuva is an exception, where we found a letter in the Geniza, in the Cairo Geniza, which we didn't plan this, but I think that was the subject of your last.
Wow, we did not plan this, but we just did a tour of the Cairo Geniza in our previous episode. So hashgacha pratis.
So there is a letter from someone in the Cairo Geniza where he has a fight. This person writing the letter is having a fight with someone over whether it's better to learn Torah, to learn halacha from the Gemara straight, or whether you can rely on shuvas of the Gaonim. And the letter that we have is actually really insulting to this person who wants to rely on the Gaonim. And the person writing the letter, who's writing this very insulting letter, says, I'm definitely right, and I'm going to prove it to you by asking a question of the Rav, the Ri Migash.
So this is interesting because, correct me if I'm mistaken, we were just talking about the Rambam, who's like two generations later or so, viewed the Ri Migash as his Rebbe. If I recall correctly, one of the main accusations made against the Rambam and his Mishnah Torah was that it would become a replacement to the study of the Gemara itself. So it sounds like this kind of concern for replacement or supersession of the Gemara was already in the works, and maybe it reached a crescendo with the Rambam's Mishnah Torah.
That's exactly a very, very interesting aspect of the historical context here, and a reason why the Rambam's work was, besides for other reasons, the Rambam had enough reasons to be controversial, but this was certainly one of them. That there's a lot going on there is basically, I think, all we can say for now.
Right. What I'm saying is, it sounds
Gosh,
like this issue was bubbling under the surface, or maybe above the surface, for quite a while. Now, I'm curious. So,
yes.
how does the Ri Migash address the concerns of the Shoel?
So interestingly, he doesn't. Some of the concerns, so to speak, like the concern you mentioned about replacing the Gemara, a lot of those things he doesn't really address head on. But this, he does have a very clear answer to the person's question about, who is fit to be called a rabbi and to paskin shilas.
I can imagine someone who's a rabbi themselves. On one hand, you can feel like a certain sense of zealotry that you want to defend the integrity of the rabbinic establishment. But on the other hand, you might also feel a sense that you need to defend the integrity because you feel threatened that once we start questioning the legitimacy of this rabbi, all rabbis, in theory, can be put on the chopping block.
Yeah. There's definitely a lot to that background as well. Um, I
But how
want to
does
get to so
but yeah, so how does the Ri Migash address it?
so the Ri Migash, what he says straight off the bat, this person who you're talking about, this person is a more qualified person to be the rabbi than so many of the people I know about nowadays who try to paskin halacha from the Gemara. Even though this
Mhm.
guy, it's maybe a theoretical, maybe a real, actual person who doesn't know how to learn halacha from the Gemara, maybe he doesn't even really know how to read Gemara, he's still going to be a perfectly qualified rabbi because better to rely on the authority of the Gaonim, on the halacha svarim, on the tshuvas of the Gaonim, than to rely on your own reading of the Gemara and try to figure out the halacha based on your own reasoning.
Oh, that is really fascinating because, again, I'm thinking about this anachronistically, but would we say the same thing for, again, just I'm taking the Rabbi Force far. I'm just like, that's just what comes to my head first. But take Panini Halacha or whatever your favorite Kitzur Shulchan Aruch, whatever your favorite contemporary halacha sefer is. I feel like we wouldn't say that about Rabbanim. In fact, you went to Smicha, I went to Smicha. Most of the time, we are actually developing our analytical skills of how to learn a sugya, how to learn Shulchan Aruch with the Nosei Kalim, and at the end of the sugya, you make sure to read up the summaries in the modern halacha svarim just to make sure you know what to do lamaisa. But that's not what we spend most of our time doing.
Exactly. And as I said, and you brought up in the question in terms of the Rambam and his Mishnah Torah, so this was the thinking among many Rabbanim that it's still at the end of the day, and I'm going to say also about contemporary smicha, at the end of the day, Rabbi Kurtz, what would your teachers tell you if you learn a particular sugya and you come out a certain way, but you see that the Mishnah Berurah and the Aruch HaShulchan and the Chayei Adam and Rabbi Forst, they all say the other way. How would you paskin halacha?
Right. And so this is, something for longtime listeners. I keep mentioning this ad nauseum, so you'll forgive me. But this was what was perhaps unique with Rav Moshe Feinstein's methodology, that he
Right.
did not take into account his contemporaries. He would only seemingly invoke them if someone mentioned their name. Like he'll bring up the Brisker Rav because the Shoel mentioned the Brisker Rav. The latest he seems to go is always seems to be like Chasim Sofer, Nod Behuda, and things you'll find in the Pischei Tshuva. But his style was learning up the Sugya and then seeing where the Gemara and where the Nosei Kalim brought him. But I guess it's an interesting question. Maybe there's a different role for a posek who is meant to be mecharesh halacha, the paskin halacha, versus your Joe pulpit rabbi like myself, who is generally not meant to be mecharesh halacha. We're meant to be mar makom, and we're meant to kind of point to you. Oh, there's that Sif and Shulchan Aruch. That'll tell you what to do. Even though I think there's gray area between those two things.
Yeah, it's always going to be a question of sort of tension or balance between those two poles, and different poskim throughout the ages have, put their flag maybe in Moshe in a way is sort of one extreme um, of independence in terms of how to paskin the halacha, whereas some, have gone in different directions. So that's certainly some of what's going on here in the background. I'll tell you, the first time that I encountered this tshuva was because it was quoted in the introduction to, now I'm forgetting if it was Yabia Omer or Yechavedat or one of those, but I'm pretty sure it was Yabia Omer, where
It's Chacham Avadia in either event.
Yes, where Chacham Avadia Yosef quotes this tshuva as explaining his methodology in appealing to mostly to precedent, or at least saying that we're not able to, and if this was true in the 12th century, even before the Rambam, that the Ri Migash is saying nobody is capable of paskening halacha just straight from the Gemara without looking in the Gaonim. If that was true in the 12th century, of course, you can imagine what the rabbis say 800 years later.
Definitely true.
So the Chacham Avadia Yosef brings this tshuva. In the next line, he brings a tshuva from the Rosh, who moved to Spain, 150 years later to Christian Spain, who expresses sort of the opposite tension, or saying, like, yes, it's good to know the tshuvas of the Gaonim, but ultimately you actually, if you want to paskin halacha, you have to know where it comes from. You have to know how the Gaonim derive that from the Gemara.
Right, and that would make sense. I mean, that's what many of the Rishonim do. You learn Tosfos. What's Tosfos doing all day? Tosfos is, how do I reconcile this Gemara in Shas with that Gemara in Shas? All these ideas emerge from the Gemara. It's hard for me to imagine how they could be ignored.
Right.
So what else?
So there are
what else from
multiple
this?
planes.
Yeah.
There's still like multiple planes of complexity here. There's the question of the shul rabbi versus the posek, and then for the posek himself, then how are you balancing those different values?
Right. Is there anything else from this tshuva that you find noteworthy in particular from the Ri Migash?
Oh my goodness, so much.
Okay, so why don't you unpack that for us?
So one thing we talked about how I think that there is a lot in this tshuva that's really, really timeless. You could imagine, a shul board that's deciding who's the most qualified applicants to be their rabbi. They're not necessarily going to be giving each of their applicants a farher in Gemara and see who's the best at learning Tosfos. There's a lot more that goes into, that kind of consideration. And I think that's something that's recognized by the Ri Migash.
Yeah, that's in my experience, that's the funny thing is, like, they don't test you on how well you could teach Gemara generally. They'll ask you, they'll see what are your fundraising skills like, can you plan a good social event? They'll ask you the high profile social issue questions. So it's Baruch Hashem, not everywhere operates like that, but it's kind of funny writ large. I'm seeing that in a lot of places nowadays. That's what they inquire about. They're not sitting down and like faharing you on Gemara. I mean, maybe I'm lucky in that respect. I don't know.
So, as I said, I think that those in a way, it's interesting to see that those were similar kinds of considerations that were going on so many years ago. But there's also a lot in this tshuva that I think is really reflective of the particular time and place. The fact that the Ri Migash is saying there's nobody nowadays who can paskin halacha without the support of the Gaonim. So this goes into like a really big question of, if sometimes in yeshivish, whatever, middle schools or high schools, they'll have like a poster of, the different generations of Torah, or like the different eras of Torah transmission. And you have like the Tanaim and the Amoraim and the Gaonim and the Rishonim, the Achronim. You know what I'm talking about?
Oh, absolutely. Those graphics are the best. The
Yeah,
funny thing is, like, when you start looking and you say, "Oh, wait a minute, that Greek philosopher lived during that time at the base of Mikdash," and all of a sudden, that's the
exactly.
funny thing because oftentimes I kind of see Jewish history on it. It's almost like a separate timeline. I know this sounds very
Right,
like
right.
DC Comics or something, but it's like operating on a separate timeline, and then saying like, "Oh, the Vilna Gaon lived around the time when the Declaration of
Right,
Independence
George
was
Washington,
announced."
yeah.
It's crazy, it's all one world.
Right. They were, well, in some ways, parallel universes. They didn't overlap too often in
Oh,
some
that's the
cases,
word I
at
was looking
least.
for. Parallel universes. Yes. Earth 1 and Earth
Um,
256.
so so basically going back to that question of where did the Geonim end and where did the Rishonim begin? So the Ri Migash is basically one of the first generations, we might say, that's very clearly in the Rishonim time period and not in like the fuzzy gray area in between. And it's a big question, like, how did this happen? Like, why? Just because, the Gonim, specifically speaking, what Gon means in the most technical sense is that they were the Rosh Yeshiva of a particular yeshiva that was like around Baghdad. The same yeshivas actually that were founded by Rav and Shmuel back in the time of the Gemara. So those Rosh Yeshiva, those were the ones who were the Gonim. But once that era kind of ended, so what? Why does that mean that on the chart you should make them a different color for the Gonim and the Rishonim?
Right,
And
and
I
it
think
imputes a certain degree of authority as well.
exactly. So I think a big part of why that is what you see in this very tshuva. You see that 100 years or so after Rav Hai Gaon died, this is when the Ri Migash is saying, now we're in a different like category. He recognizes that the Gaonim are now people that you have to contend with if you're going to be learning halacha seriously. And I think that that's a very similar phenomenon that we see at the end of the Rishonim. And we can talk about or not talk about whether that also happened more recently, but at least we see those same similar kinds of expressions of, well, the reason why the era of Torah ends at a certain time period is because the people afterwards consider the ones that came before them to be like in a different category.
Right, and it just reminds me, I believe we have an episode with Rabbi Shmuel Phillips a while back, which we were dealing with this question. And is there a distinction also if we're talking about Onim and Bavel versus those who come from a more of a Yerushalmi tradition? Those with a Yerushalmi tradition might say that we have priority. Those from Bavel might say we come from the great yeshivas in Bavel, we have priority. So these are interesting questions that emerge from there as well. Were there other particular insights that jumped out to you from the Ri Migash's tshuva?
Yeah, the
I only
other
ask because I know that you do have.
thank you. The other aspect of this tshuva that I find super, super fascinating, and now I guess we talked about past, present, and maybe even we could talk a little bit about future, even though future is always uncertain. But I think one of the really interesting aspects about the way that the Ri Migash discusses this tshuva is a question of like what people today call media studies. Based off of Marshall McLuhan's famous phrase, "The medium is the message." That the way that halachic information or Torah is conveyed is itself important, or itself has like some weight. Like if you can imagine, sort of going back to bringing it back to the world of halacha. So if you can imagine, like a woman comes to the rabbi with a chicken, and she sees something weird about it. She doesn't know, is this chicken acceptable? Is it maybe a treifa? And so she's coming to ask the rabbi, tell me, Hashem, God, who brought my forefathers out of Egypt so many years ago, the creator of heavens and earth, does he want me to eat this chicken? And you, Rabbi Kurtz, know that the answer to that question, it's in the Mishnah, it's in the Gemara, probably in Maseches Chulin, it's also in the Shulchan Aruch. It might be, I don't know if Rabbi Forrest has a sefer on Trefos, but a contemporary sefer on Trefos. And you have all these different options, even if maybe you've memorized them, but if you're like looking at them in your head, you have all these different options of where you can get the answer to that halachic question. So where does that answer come from? And the Ri Migash recognizes that even if the answer might be the same in the Gemara and in the Tshuva of the Gaonim or in the Sefer of the Gaonim, like the Bahag or whatever it may be, even if the answer might be there, there's a very big difference in accessibility and in how you'd be able to interpret that information depending on where you get it from. To me, I think that this is just such an interesting aspect of how sort of the different media, the different ways of conveying Torah information really might have some impact on the reliability of that information. I know you spoke about also in the context of the Trumas Hadeshin, whether or not those were real live questions and answers. Does that make it more reliable or less reliable, or how you would interpret the Trumas Hadeshin differently based on what the actual context is? Is this a halacha sefer, or is this a tshuva sefer, or something in between?
Right. And I'm thinking about mediums of how we send information around today. I had a question about a hashgacha yesterday that was asked to me by a balabas. I wasn't familiar with it. I reached out to a colleague who I know has an expertise in hashgachos and kashrus. What's your take on it? And then they forwarded me a message from another colleague from a WhatsApp group where this was asked. And nowadays I think there's like books coming out where every rabbi has their own Q&A WhatsApp group, and people are publishing. So this is like a new way that we transport information to people, and it leads, I think, to a certain degree of informality, perhaps as well. You don't have to think as much before writing a response in a WhatsApp group as you do about composing a tshuva and then publishing it.
Right. So does that make those two things different? Does it mean that, the tshuva that you get on WhatsApp from your Rav, and then if he takes that same tshuva and then, I mean, I know this has been done, and then edits it into a book and then publishes that book that you can buy in the Safer store, does that change? Does that actually make a difference? And does it make a difference if you're getting, the same, trying to learn the same information from I don't know, Twitter threads or TikTok or the hard dead trees kind of books.
Right. And even, different kinds of books. So, for instance, someone gave me a very valid critique of something I wrote recently, in which I would cite something. I'm writing essays on Rav Moshe Feinstein, so I'll cite something from Igros Moshe, and I'll cite something from Masoros Moshe. But Masoros Moshe was his grandson who was
Mm-hmm.
Mishamish for many years, and Rav Moshe would make off the cuff comments, and he would transcribe those and adapt them into Masoros Moshe. So maybe there's a nafkamina between what, first of all, Rav Moshe wrote himself and actually took time to deliberate through versus an off-the-cuff comment. And you see that nowadays, I think, with where Chaim Kanievsky had something like this. There's these svarim in which they'll ask the rabbi almost a yes or no question, and then the mechaber, he'll write a whole exposition that goes on for pages upon pages upon pages of footnotes explaining what was behind that yes or no. And I always wonder how much of it is like their imagination, how much of it is the original authorial intent. So that's also a genre that's developed nowadays.
Exactly.
As
That is what the Ri Migash is speaking about. He's speaking about different kinds of, different genre of literature, we might say.
Right. And so what else should we know either about this tshuva or about the Ri Migash as we are starting to come to the end?
So I don't know how much more time we have. I think there's also some very interesting ways in which this is sort of reflective of kind of, you started bringing it up about these questions that were going on at the time about how to learn Gemara and how to paskin halacha, and what was changing in terms of what the Rambam set out to do, which was to create this, new halachic work. The Ri Migash was also friends, or at least corresponded with, probably friends, let's hope, with Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, who was the author of the very well-known philosophical work, Kuzari. And I think that there also is actually some very interesting parallels between how, this is a really long topic, but how the Kuzari sort of frames the way that you would reason about religious and philosophical questions, which is by asking a rabbi, or asking the, maybe it would be starting off with other professors of religion, and how the Ri Migash is also saying that, if you're just a regular rabbi, then you really should be relying on the halachic authorities of the Gaonim instead of trying to reasoning through things yourself.
And that's fascinating. We were talking about parallel universes between general world history and Jewish history. And even within Jewish history, sometimes because we bifurcate between halacha and the machshava, I didn't even think to put the Ri Migash and Kuzari together in my mind.
Right. They actually did live in the same city for a little while, and they there's some fascinating correspondence between the two. Actually, there's one where we have again from the Cairo Geniza, we actually found over 50 letters, either to or from Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, and one of them is discussing some efforts that he is engaged in to try to free or ransom a captive, a Jewish girl who was taken captive, and he's getting the Ri Migash involved in that. We have a letter from the Ri Migash. So again, about parallel universes, I mentioned, forget about that backwater that was Christian Europe. But we actually have a letter from the Ri Migash saying that he had heard that there was someone in Europe who wrote a commentary on the Gemara that included Kodshim. And he was really excited about this.
Wow.
And he really wanted to get it from, he was talking to the Chachmei Provence, who were like in between France and Muslim Spain. He heard about this French scholar and he was really excited about it. He's probably talking about Rashi.
Right. Oh, that's amazing. And he's like, I heard of this guy, don't really know who he is. Some people call him Rashi.
Right. He doesn't say any names. He may not have very much information about him, but
I mean, I think that's,
but
by the way,
heard
that's,
that there's like someone who wrote a commentary on Kodshim. He was so excited.
I mean, that's what makes the Gaonim the most impressive generation, because they had to learn the Gemara without Rashi.
Exactly.
So that's what definitely puts them on a higher level. As we are approaching the end of our time today, is there anything more generally about the Ri Migash you want us to know about, and also more broadly about your Rishonim podcast that you do? Because clearly, you want to share with us the Ri Migash, but there's a lot more I know you have to share, and I'm not asking you to summarize every episode that you've done already, but maybe give our listeners a bit of a flavor, a bit of a sample of what you have to offer.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate the opportunity to plug my own work, which is it's still sort of a relatively new work in progress, but I've been working on podcasting the Rishonim. So I started from Rabbeinu Hananel and just discussing their works and some of their ideas and trying to, see how far I get in terms of this, new, or it's not so new, but this other interesting medium called podcasting.
Mm-hmm.
And what I try to do is I try to discuss a little bit about like the intellectual background, like we talked about in terms of the Ri Migash, that he was, I don't think I even mentioned actually. Now, at the very end of the episode, I should mention that the Ri Migash is actually a member of a long line of great rabbis from Muslim Spain. There is the RIETS, as he's usually called in yeshivas, Rabbi Yitzchak ibn Giyat, and that's how he's referred to, not in yeshivas, I guess. And he was the sort of a Rosh Yeshiva. It's not exactly clear what Rosh Yeshiva means in this context, but let's assume that he was the Rosh Yeshiva in Lucena. This is where the Ri Migash lived. This is the city in Muslim Spain, or Alistena, as they usually called it in their Hebrew writings. And the city of Lucena itself is like really interesting because we have all these hints that it was just a city of only Jews. But it seems like the pride of Lucena was this yeshiva, or the fact that they always had these big rabbis living there. After the Ritzkias was the Rif, who many listeners will hopefully have heard of.
I think I've heard his name a few times.
Yeah, so the Rif and the Ritzkiad are also sort of like this in this transitional period, because the Rif was born while Rav Hai Gaon was still alive. So that's on the sort of the opposite end of the world. The Rif is in Spain and Rav Hai Gaon was living in Baghdad. But at least this is why the Rif is maybe sort of an in-between Rishonim and Gaonim figure.
We'll have to consult the charts to see which era they put him in. I think it's amazing how authoritative those charts are, by the way.
Yeah. It's generations and generations of students have their ideas about the Rishonim shaped by those kinds of things.
I know there's just some like graphic designer who put it. I don't know who it was. Some graphic designer put it together, and now that's like halacha for everyone. Halacha l'Moshe Misidai.
Right. If it were me, I would do like a fade in of colors, but I don't know if they have that technology.
Right. And anything else we should know about the podcast?
Yes, the Ri Migash he took over for the Rif. The Rif actually appointed him as his successor. So that makes him really interesting. Anyway, so all these people, the Ritzkiat and the Rif and the Ri Migash, and we mentioned the Rambam. So all of these people are, I think, really, really just fascinating figures. They have shaped Torah through their writings. And so what I try to do in the Rishonim podcast is to discuss their writings, sometimes, as I mentioned, with a little bit of that intellectual historical background, but mostly I'm not an expert. I call it a fan account or a fan podcast. It's just I'm a huge fan of these people, and so I just talk about, if I'm talking about the Rabbeinu Hananel, so my episode about Rabbeinu Hananel is basically, I mean, I structure it a little bit, but it's basically just like my 20 favorite things in Rabbeinu Hananel's commentary on Shas. And
I
that's
think that's remarkable. And again, my apologies if my cold is coming through today, so I might not articulate myself properly. But I just want to express appreciation because I think there is a dearth of Jewish podcasts. There's a few out there, but there's a dearth of them that, on the one hand, and this was the goal behind Shoot First, Ask Questions Later. On the one hand, if it's a Jewish podcast, there should be real Jewish content, not just talking about what's the next hot topic that Jews are facing. And on the other hand, I didn't want just to be like a YU Torah class that someone happened to slap a phone down in front of someone while they're giving a monologue, giving a shiur. And the way that I've listened to you structure things and how well thought out it is, and it's like kind of has this narrative feel to it. It's something that I highly recommend to our listeners. I'll make sure to link it. And again, I'm always just like impressed when, you're being very modest when you came on the podcast initially, saying that you were underqualified. I found in life that sometimes I'm more impressed by the people who are not in the rabbinic line of work, who know a lot of Torah, than the people like myself who actually do it for a job. So Yasher Koach, you were very qualified to be on here. And I want to thank you very much for your time, Chef Katiyatzach, in your Torah and in your microbiology as well.
Thank you so much. I mean, and the same to you. I'm so impressed by your podcast and your writings. They're really excellent. Keep up the amazing work, bringing the tshuvas to the people.
Amen v'chein lamar.